I'm Lieutenant Colonel Christina Reeve, 39, a U.S. Air Force pilot who's spent most of her adult life flying into places most people only see on the news. For years, I carried my family's pride, showing up, providing, keeping the peace, no matter what the uniform cost me. But when my own sister laughed at my therapy sessions and said, "PTSD isn't real, it's for attention," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being doubted or disrespected, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, truth, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. At first, the comments were small. Jokes at my expense, eye rolls when I mentioned work. My sister, Lila, had always been the outspoken one in the family. Growing up, that meant she was the one who asked the hard questions, the one who challenged Dad at the dinner table, the one who never backed down from an argument. I admired that about her once. But when I came home from my second deployment, something had shifted. The admiration I used to see in her eyes had been replaced with something else. Something that looked like skepticism. She mocked my therapy appointments. Not directly at first, but in that way where you know exactly what someone means even when they're pretending to be subtle. A raised eyebrow when I mentioned I had to leave early on Thursdays. A comment about how everyone's in therapy these days, delivered with just enough edge to sting. I laughed it off. That's what you do when you're trained to compartmentalize, when you've spent years learning how to push things down and keep moving forward. But the tension was real. I could feel it sitting heavy between us at family dinners, in the pauses that lasted too long, in the way she'd change the subject whenever I started talking about anything related to the Air Force. One night, about 3 weeks after I'd been back stateside, we were all having dinner at my parents' place. Mom had made pot roast, the way she always did when I came home, like if she fed me enough I might stay longer. Dad sat at the head of the table, quieter than usual. He'd retired from the Army 5 years earlier as a full colonel, and I think part of him still missed it. Or maybe he just didn't know how to navigate the space between his 2 daughters anymore. Lila was talking about her job, something about a difficult client, and a project that was taking too long. I was half listening, moving food around my plate, when she turned to me and said, "You know what your problem is, Chris? You take everything too seriously." I looked up. What's that supposed to mean? She shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. Just that you've always been so intense about everything. Even when we were kids. You couldn't just play a game, you had to win it. You couldn't just do well in school, you had to be the best. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And now with this whole therapy thing, it's like you're making such a production out of coming home. Mom set down her fork. Lila. What? I'm just saying. She looked at me again. You fly planes, right? You're not on the ground fighting wars. I just don't get why it has to be such a big deal. I felt my jaw tighten. The thing about comments like that is they're designed to look innocent on the surface. If I reacted, I'd be the one overreacting. If I defended myself, I'd be proving her point. So I did what I'd learned to do in high-pressure situations. I stayed calm. I kept my voice level. It's different than you think it is, I said. She rolled her eyes. It was subtle, quick, but I saw it. Dad cleared his throat and asked Lila about her apartment, steering the conversation somewhere safer. Mom gave me a look that said she was sorry, that she wished things were different. And I sat there thinking about how my own sister had just reduced everything I'd done, everything I'd seen, to me being dramatic. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain it to her. How do you tell someone about the sound of alarms in a cockpit when you're taking fire? How do you describe what it feels like to be responsible for getting people out alive, knowing that every decision you make could mean someone doesn't go home? How do you explain the weight of those nights when you close your eyes and you're right back there, feeling the aircraft shudder, hearing the voices on the radio, seeing the red lights on your instruments? You don't. Because some things can't be explained. They can only be understood by people who've been through them. After that dinner, I started noticing more. The way Lila would talk about veterans like they were some monolithic group, all playing the same card to get sympathy. The way she'd share articles online about military spending and waste, as if that somehow invalidated what individual service members went through. The way she'd make jokes about military worship when someone thanked me for my service in public. It was like she'd built this narrative in her head where being in the military meant you were either a hero beyond reproach or you were faking it for attention, and she'd decided I fell into the latter category. Mom tried to smooth things over. She always did. She'd call me separately and apologize for Lila, explain that she was just stressed with work, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But I knew better. Lila meant exactly what she said. She just didn't think the consequences would ever catch up to her. I went back to my appointments on Thursdays. My therapist, Dr. Rahman, was former Navy, so she understood the language I spoke even when I couldn't find the right words. She didn't push me to talk about the missions I couldn't discuss, but she helped me work through the things I could. The hypervigilance. The way loud noises made me flinch. The nightmares that came in waves, sometimes every night for a week, sometimes absent for a month before returning with a vengeance. Your sister doesn't understand, Dr. Rahman said one session, after I'd told her about the dinner. No, I agreed. She doesn't. Does that bother you? I thought about it. It bothers me that she doesn't try to understand. There's a difference between not knowing something and actively dismissing it. Dr. Rahman nodded. That's a fair distinction. I kept going to dinners because that's what you do when you have family. You show up. You try. But every time, there was something. A comment about how I seemed fine, so maybe I didn't really need therapy. A joke about how cushy the Air Force was compared to the Army, delivered with a pointed look at Dad like she was trying to get him on her side. A story about someone she knew who'd gotten over their PTSD by just choosing to move on. Dad never said much. He'd change the subject or refill someone's drink or suddenly remember something he needed to check on in the garage. I understood that. He'd spent 30 years in the Army, climbed his way to colonel, and he'd learned that sometimes the best strategy is to avoid the battlefield altogether. But part of me wished he'd say something. Just once. Just to let Lila know that what she was saying wasn't okay. 3 months after that first difficult dinner, I was promoted to major. It was a good moment, one I'd worked hard for. Oh, for at 33, right on track for someone who'd commissioned at 23 and kept their head down and their performance high. Mom was proud. Dad shook my hand with that firm grip that said more than words could. And Lila congratulated me with all the enthusiasm of someone commenting on the weather. That's great, she said, barely looking up from her phone. So, what does that mean exactly? It means more responsibility, I said. Different command structure. Different expectations. She nodded vaguely, already scrolling through something else. And that's when I started to realize that this wasn't about her not understanding. This was about her not wanting to understand. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that, in choosing ignorance when knowledge is available. In deciding that your version of someone's story is more convenient than their reality. But I said nothing. I smiled and thanked everyone for coming to the small celebration dinner Mom had organized. I cut into the cake she'd ordered with my rank insignia in frosting. And I went home to my empty apartment wondering when exactly my sister had stopped being someone I could trust. The breaking point came 6 months later at another family dinner. By then, I'd stopped talking about work entirely. I'd learned that any mention of the Air Force would lead to some comment from Lila, some subtle dig wrapped in a joke or a question that wasn't really a question. So I kept things surface level. I asked about her life, listened to Mom talk about her book club, let Dad tell his old Army stories that we'd all heard a dozen times before. It was easier that way. Safer. But that night, something was different. Lila had been drinking more than usual. Not drunk, but loose. Uninhibited. The kind of state where people say what they really think and later claim they didn't mean it. We were talking about a news story, something about increased funding for veteran services. Mom thought it was good. Dad was characteristically neutral, always careful about commenting on policy. And Lila scoffed. It's such a scam, she said, refilling her wine glass. All this money going to people who are perfectly fine but know how to work the system. Mom shifted uncomfortably. Lila, I don't think that's fair. Come on, Mom. You know it's true. She leaned back in her chair, that familiar challenging look in her eyes. Half these people claiming PTSD are just milking it for sympathy. They want the hero worship without actually having done anything heroic. The table went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes moving toward me, waiting to see how I'd respond. My hands were flat on the table, pressed against the wood hard enough that my fingertips were white. I kept my breathing steady. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way Dr. Rahman had taught me. Not everyone talks about what they've done, I said quietly. Lila laughed. Actually laughed. Right. The strong silent type. Very convenient. She looked at me directly then, and there was something almost triumphant in her expression. Like she'd been waiting for this moment. You want to know what I think? I think PTSD isn't even real. Not the way people claim it is. It's just the newest way for people to play the victim and get attention. I should have walked away. That would have been the smart thing, the mature thing. But I couldn't move. I sat there, my entire body rigid, while my sister reduced every night I'd spent staring at the ceiling, every appointment with Dr. Rahman, every brother and sister in arms who'd struggled or worse to a performance for attention. Lila. Dad's voice was low, warning. But she wasn't done. I'm just saying what everyone thinks. Chris sits here acting traumatized, but what did she actually do? Fly some planes? Transport some cargo? It's not like she was in combat. It's not like she was actually in danger. Mom whispered my name. Just Christina, soft and pleading. But I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at any of them. If I opened my mouth, if I let even one word out, I would lose control. And I'd spent too many years learning control to throw it away on someone who wouldn't understand even if I tried to explain. So I sat there, silent, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. The kind that gets in your lungs and stays there. Dad looked away, staring at something over my shoulder. Mom's eyes were wet, but she didn't say anything else. And Lila took another sip of her wine, satisfied with whatever point she thought she'd made. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I have no memory of what we ate, what we talked about, whether I said anything at all. I remember the mechanical motions of cutting food, lifting a fork, chewing without tasting. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat, too loud in my ears. And I remember the exact tone of Lila's laugh when she'd said it. That casual cruelty, like she was commenting on the weather or a TV show rather than dismissing something that had fundamentally changed who I was. After dinner, everyone moved to the living room. Dad turned on the television, probably desperate for something to fill the silence. A news program was starting, one of those evening specials. Mom brought out coffee. Lila checked her phone, already moving on from what she'd said like it was nothing. And that's when everything changed. The program was about military operations in Afghanistan. Recent enough to be relevant, old enough to be declassified. The reporter was interviewing senior military leadership about a particular operation that had taken place 2 years earlier. I recognized the time frame immediately. I recognized the region they were talking about. And then I saw him on screen. General Robert Vance. 2 stars. Silver hair. The same focused intensity he'd had in briefings, but tempered now with the careful media training all senior officers received. He was talking about a mission, describing it in broad strokes, the way you do when most of the details are still classified. This particular operation was critical, he was saying. We had a small team stranded at an outpost, taking heavy fire. Standard evacuation routes were compromised. We needed someone who could fly in low, navigate hostile conditions, and extract personnel under extreme duress. I stopped breathing. I knew what was coming. I'd been told it might be declassified eventually, but I hadn't expected it to be now, here, like this. The reporter asked, "And you found someone who could do that?" General Vance nodded. His expression changed, became something almost reverent. There's one officer I'll never forget. Major Christina Reeve. Without her, none of us would have made it out alive. I heard the fork hit the plate before I registered that Lila had dropped it. The sound was sharp, metallic, too loud in the sudden silence of the living room. Everyone turned to look at me. Mom's hand went to her mouth. Dad sat perfectly still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. And Lila stared at the television screen like she was trying to rewrite what she'd just heard. The general kept talking. The mission was designated Reaper Outpost. We can't go into all the specifics, but what I can tell you is that Major Reeve flew into a hot zone under fire, with multiple systems compromised. She made 3 passes when any reasonable pilot would have called it. She got every single person out. 15 souls that wouldn't be here if she hadn't been willing to risk everything. He paused, and the camera caught something in his expression that I recognized. That look that comes from understanding exactly what was at stake, what could have gone wrong, what it costs to make those decisions. I've served with a lot of brave men and women, General Vance continued. But what Major Reeve did that day goes beyond bravery. It was skill, determination, and a refusal to leave anyone behind even when every tactical consideration said it was impossible. We'd all be dead without her. I mean that literally. The interview moved on to other topics, but I couldn't hear them anymore. The sound had turned to white noise in my ears. My hands were still tight around my water glass, my knuckles white, my whole body locked in that same rigid control I'd maintained through dinner. I could feel everyone looking at me, but I kept my eyes on the television screen, watching General Vance's face even as he talked about something else now. No one spoke. Not immediately. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, until finally Mom said, "Christina, why didn't you? It's classified," I said. My voice came out flat, emotionless. Most of it still is. Dad's face had gone pale. He understood, in a way Mom and Lila couldn't, exactly what the general's words meant. He'd been in combat. He'd made impossible decisions. He knew the weight of what had just been described, even with all the details that had been left out. Lila's mouth opened and closed. She looked at me, then at the television, then back at me. I watched her trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew, the one she'd spent months dismissing and diminishing, with the officer the general had just described. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the recalibration of her entire understanding. I stood up. Carefully, precisely. "I should go." "Christina," Mom started. "Thank you for dinner." I kept my voice level professional. The same tone I used in briefings. Then I walked to the door, grabbed my jacket, and left. Outside, the night air hit my face like a slap. Cold and sharp and real. I sat in my car for a long time before I started the engine, my hands on the steering wheel, staring at my parents' house through the windshield. Inside, I could see their silhouettes moving in the living room. Talking, probably. About me. About what the general had said. About all the things Lila had gotten wrong. I drove home in silence. No music. No radio. Just the sound of the road and my own breathing and the careful, controlled thought that kept running through my head. This wasn't revenge. I hadn't orchestrated this. I hadn't even known the interview would air. But the truth had spoken for itself, and sometimes that's the most powerful vindication of all. Before that night, we were close. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story. Lila and I weren't always at odds. There was a time when she was my best friend, my partner in crime, the person who knew me better than anyone. We grew up military, with Dad retired Army and every aspect of our childhood structured around discipline, routine, and the expectation that we'd both figure out who we were within that framework. But where I thrived in the structure, Lila chafed against it. I was the steady one. The planner. The one who did her homework on time, kept her room inspection ready, never talked back even when I disagreed. Lila was the wild card. She'd sneak out, challenge Dad's rules, push every boundary she could find just to see what would happen. And somehow, despite being completely different, we worked. I covered for her when she needed it. She pushed me to loosen up when I was wound too tight. We balanced each other. When I told the family I was joining ROTC in college, Lila was the first one to congratulate me. She bragged to her friends about her cool pilot sister before I'd even earned my wings. She'd call me at school to ask about flight training, wanted to hear every detail about what it was like to take a plane up for the first time. When I commissioned at 23, she was there in her nicest dress, watching me take the oath, and I could see the pride in her face. Real pride. The kind that can't be faked. But as the years passed, something shifted. Iraq happened. Then Syria. Deployments that lasted months, to places I couldn't talk about, doing things I couldn't describe. The calls from Lila became less frequent. The questions stopped. When I came home on leave, she'd ask surface-level things. How was the flight? How's the weather there? Did I see anything interesting? But never anything deeper. Never anything that would require me to explain what the missions actually entailed. I told myself she was just busy. She'd started her career in marketing, working long hours trying to make a name for herself. She was dating someone new every time I came home. She had her own life, her own concerns, and that was fine. Normal, even. People grow apart. Especially when one of them is gone for months at a time, living a life the other one can't access. By the time I made major at 33, the distance between us had become a canyon. She barely reacted to the promotion. Didn't ask what it meant, what new responsibilities came with it, what I'd done to earn it. At family dinners, she'd spend more time on her phone than talking to me. When I mentioned anything about work, her eyes would glaze over with disinterest. It was like I'd become someone she didn't recognize anymore. The truth, I eventually realized, was simpler than I wanted to admit. She didn't like who I'd become. Or maybe she didn't like that I'd become someone she couldn't understand. The steady, predictable older sister had turned into someone with classified missions and security clearances and experiences that couldn't be shared over dinner. I'd become a stranger. And instead of trying to bridge that gap, she decided to dismiss what she didn't understand. Dad saw it happening. I know he did. But he'd spent 30 years in the army learning when to engage and when to retreat, and he chose retreat. Maybe he thought we'd work it out on our own. Maybe he didn't want to take sides between his daughters. Or maybe, having served himself, he understood that there are some things you can't explain to someone who hasn't been there, and he didn't want to force Lila to understand something she wasn't ready to face. Mom tried harder. She'd pull me aside at the end of dinners and apologize for Lila's attitude. She'd make excuses about stress or work or whatever crisis Lila was navigating that week. But I could see the worry in her eyes. Not just worry about her daughters growing apart, but worry about me specifically. Worry about what I'd seen, what I carried, what I wasn't saying. She was the one who'd first suggested therapy, actually. Gently, carefully, like she was afraid I'd take it as an insult. You know, there's no shame in talking to someone, she'd said one night, just the two of us in her kitchen while Dad and Lila were in the other room. After everything you've been through. I'd wanted to ask her what she thought I'd been through. What Dad had told her, what she'd pieced together from news reports and deployments, and the classified stamps on my orders. But I didn't. I just nodded and said I'd think about it. I started seeing Dr. Rahman 3 months later. Not because of Mom's suggestion, but because I'd had a panic attack in a grocery store when a car backfired in the parking lot. I dropped to the ground behind my car, heart racing, unable to breathe, convinced for 30 seconds that I was back in the cockpit with alarms screaming and fire coming from below. A woman found me there, crouched between vehicles, and asked if I needed help. The look on her face, concern mixed with confusion, made me realize I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Dr. Rahman didn't push me to talk about specifics. She understood clearances, understood that some things couldn't be discussed even in the privacy of her office. Instead, we worked on the symptoms. The hypervigilance that made me check every room I entered. The way loud noises sent my pulse skyrocketing. The nightmares that varied in content but always had the same theme, people depending on me and me failing them. PTSD isn't about being weak, she told me in one of our early sessions. It's about your brain trying to process experiences it wasn't designed to process. You're not broken. You're human. I wanted to believe her. Some days I did. But other days, especially after family dinners where Lila made her subtle comments about veterans and attention-seeking, I wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I was just being dramatic. Maybe what I'd experienced wasn't actually that bad. Maybe everyone else who'd been through similar things just handled it better than I did. But then I'd remember Reaper Outpost. The sound of gunfire ricocheting off the aircraft. The voice of the squad leader on the radio, trying to stay calm while telling me they had wounded who wouldn't make it without immediate evac. The way my co-pilot, Captain Miles Ortega, had looked at me when I said we were going back in for a third pass. He didn't argue. Didn't question. Just nodded and checked our fuel levels and helped me line up the approach one more time. We got everyone out. All 15. Some of them barely, loaded onto the aircraft with blood-soaked bandages and morphine-hazed eyes. But alive. We got them out alive, and that was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to make it worth it. Except every night for months afterward, I'd dream about what would have happened if I'd miscalculated. If I'd been 3 seconds slower. If the enemy fire had been 3 inches to the left. In the dreams, I didn't get everyone out. In the dreams, I had to leave people behind. And I'd wake up with my heart pounding, taking inventory of who'd made it, recounting the names like a rosary. Lila knew none of this. She knew I flew planes. She knew I'd deployed. She probably knew vaguely that I'd been to dangerous places. But the specifics, the reality of what those deployments meant, were as foreign to her as her marketing campaigns and client presentations were to me. The difference was I tried to understand her world. I asked questions. I listened. I made an effort. She decided hers was the only reality that mattered. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The way she'd change the subject whenever anyone thanked me for my service in public, like she was embarrassed by the attention. The articles she'd share on social media about military spending, always with captions about waste and abuse, never about the actual people in uniform. The jokes she'd make about military worship and hero culture, like the whole thing was a performance rather than people's lives. I should have said something earlier. Should have confronted her before that final dinner. But I kept thinking it would get better. That eventually she'd mature, understand that the world was more complex than her opinions about it. That maybe, if I just gave her time and space, she'd come around on her own. I was wrong. Some people don't come around. Some people need reality to hit them in the face before they'll reconsider their worldview. And sometimes, the universe provides that reality in the form of a 2-star general on the evening news, telling the truth you weren't allowed to tell yourself. After dinner, I sat outside on my apartment's small balcony. 4th floor, overlooking a parking lot that wasn't much to look at, but it was quiet and the air felt clean. The night had that particular quality of silence that reminded me of deployment air right before something happened. Heavy. Waiting. That comment stuck in my head like a song I couldn't stop playing. It's for attention. 3 words, delivered with such casual certainty, such absolute conviction that she was right. All those missions, all those nights, all those moments where I'd had to make decisions that would determine whether people lived or died, erased in a single sentence. Reduced to performance. To manipulation. To a bid for sympathy I'd never even asked for. I thought about the blackout landings. Coming in with no lights, no radio communication, nothing that could give away position to hostiles on the ground. Just instruments and instinct and the kind of trust in your training that feels like faith. I thought about the medevac missions under fire, where you're racing against time and blood loss, and the very real possibility that you won't make it out either. I thought about the loss reports I'd signed, the ones where we didn't make it in time, where someone's name became a line item on a document that would eventually reach a family who'd never know all the details of how their loved one died. And I thought about Lila laughing. Actually laughing like the whole thing was a joke. The general's interview had changed something. Not fixed it exactly, but cracked it open. My phone had buzzed 3 times since I'd left my parents' house. Twice from Mom, once from Dad. I hadn't looked at the messages. Didn't need to. I could imagine what they said. Apologizing for Lila. Explaining what the general had talked about, as if I hadn't been there, as if I needed someone to translate my own experience back to me. Asking me to come back, to talk, to help them understand. But I was tired of explaining. Tired of defending. Tired of trying to make people understand something they'd already decided they didn't want to know. For the first time since I'd started therapy, I realized something Dr. Rahman had been trying to tell me for months. Lila's ignorance wasn't my burden to fix. Her unwillingness to understand, her active choice to dismiss and diminish, wasn't something I could change through more explanation or more patience or more careful choosing of words. Some people don't want to understand. They want their version of the story because it's easier, cleaner, doesn't require them to examine their own assumptions or prejudices. You can't teach empathy to someone who's never had to survive silence. That was the line that kept running through my head. The silence of a cockpit when all the systems are screaming and you have to shut out everything except the essential information. The silence after a mission when you're running through every decision, every second, wondering if you could have done it better, faster, safer. The silence of 3 in the morning when the nightmares wake you up and you lie there trying to remember that you're home, you're safe, it's over. Lila had never had to survive that kind of silence. Her life was full of noise, opinions, judgments, constant commentary on everything and everyone. She'd never had to shut it all down and focus on the one thing that mattered, the one decision that would determine everything. And because she'd never had to do that, she couldn't understand why anyone else would need time and space and help to process having done it. My phone buzzed again. I turned it face down on the small table beside my chair and watched the parking lot below. A couple was getting out of their car, laughing about something. Normal life. Regular problems. I didn't resent them for it. If anything, I envied how uncomplicated their evening seemed. The next day, I had a session with Dr. Rahman. I told her about the dinner, about Lila's comments, about the general's interview. How did it feel? She asked. Hearing him describe the mission publicly? I considered the question. Strange. Like he was talking about someone else. I paused. But also validating. Not because I needed him to prove anything, but because Lila heard it. My parents heard it. They heard someone with actual authority, someone who was there, explain what really happened. Does that change anything for you? With your sister? No, I said. And I meant it. She's the one who has to change, not me. I can't make her understand. I can't make her care. That's on her. Dr. Rahman nodded. That's growth, Christina. Recognizing where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Over the next week, I started making decisions I should have made months earlier. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who'd already made up their minds. I stopped covering for Lila when she couldn't make rent, something I'd been doing on and off for 2 years because family helps family, and I made more money than she did. I stopped accepting invitations to dinners where I knew I'd spend the evening walking on eggshells, monitoring every word to avoid giving her ammunition for another comment. Distance became necessary. Not as punishment, but as preservation. I couldn't keep putting myself in situations where my own sister treated my trauma as theater, my service as suspect, my struggles as manipulation. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't sustainable. And it wasn't what I deserved after everything I'd given. Then I got the call. My old squadron commander, now at Joint Base Andrews, asking if I'd be interested in a rotation there. Training duty, helping shape the next generation of pilots. It would mean leaving my current posting, relocating to Maryland, stepping back from operational flying for a while. A year earlier, I would have said no immediately. Operational flying was what I did, who I was. But standing in my apartment, looking at the packed boxes I hadn't unpacked from my last move because I'd never really settled in, I realized it was exactly what I needed. Yes, I told him. When do you need me? 3 weeks later, I was packing up my apartment. Mom helped, carefully wrapping dishes in newspaper, not asking the questions I could see in her face. Dad showed up with his truck to move the furniture. And Lila sent a text saying she was sorry she couldn't make it, she had a work thing. I didn't respond. At Joint Base Andrews, I fell into the new rhythm easily. Training flights were different from operational missions. Lower stakes in some ways, higher in others. Every mistake a student made was a teaching moment, but it was also a reminder that these were the people who'd eventually be flying into the same situations I'd faced. Getting it right here in training could mean the difference between them making it home or not. I was good at it. Better than I expected. Maybe because I remembered what it was like to be new, uncertain, trying to prove yourself. Or maybe because I'd seen enough consequences to know exactly what to emphasize, what couldn't be shortcut, what would save their lives someday when everything went wrong. 2 months into the rotation, my old unit contacted me about an interview. General Vance was doing a series of interviews about recent operations, and one of them would focus on Reaper Outpost. It was being declassified, at least partially, and they wanted to know if I had any objections to him discussing my role. I almost laughed. After everything, after Lila's dismissal and the casual cruelty of her assumptions, the universe was offering me vindication I hadn't asked for. But it wasn't about her. It never had been. Reaper Outpost was about 15 people who made it home because a team did their jobs under impossible circumstances. If telling that story helped people understand what military service actually meant, what it cost, what it required, then that was reason enough. No objections, I told them. I didn't think much about it after that. Didn't mark the date on my calendar or plan to watch. It was just another interview, another piece of the military's ongoing public relations effort to help civilians understand what service members did. I certainly didn't expect to be at my parents' house when it aired. Didn't expect Lila to be there, making the exact comments that would set up the perfect collision between her assumptions and reality. But that's how it happened. That's how the truth finally spoke for itself, without me having to say a word. I stopped trying to explain myself. That was the first real decision I made after that night, and it changed everything. No more defending my therapy appointments when Lila made comments. No more carefully choosing words at family dinners to avoid setting her off. No more pretending that if I just found the right way to say it, she'd understand. She wouldn't. She'd made that clear. And continuing to try was only hurting me. The second decision was financial. For 2 years, I'd been supplementing Lila's rent. Not every month, but often enough that it had become expected. She'd call with some crisis, unexpected car repair, medical bill, client who hadn't paid on time, and I'd transfer money because that's what family did. Because I made a decent salary as an O4, and she was struggling to build her career, and it seemed like the right thing to do. But after that dinner, after her comments about veterans milking the system for sympathy, I realized I was enabling her. She could dismiss my service, mock my trauma, and still expect me to fund her lifestyle? No. That particular arrangement was done. When she texted 3 days after the general's interview, "Hey, can you spot me for rent this month? Client payment got delayed," I responded with one word: no. She called immediately. I didn't answer. She texted again. "Seriously? It's just till next week when the check clears." I put my phone on silent. She sent another message an hour later. "Wow, okay, guess I know where I stand." I wanted to respond. Wanted to tell her that yes, she did know where she stood, and she'd put herself there. But engaging would only start a cycle I didn't want to be part of. So I left it on read and went back to work. The base at Joint Base Andrews was different from my previous postings. More structured in some ways, less intense in others. Training rotations meant regular hours, predictable schedules. I could actually make plans more than a day in advance. I started running in the mornings again, something I hadn't had the energy for in years. Started cooking real meals instead of surviving on whatever was quickest. Small things, but they added up to feeling more like myself than I had since before that first deployment. The younger officers I trained were sharp. Some of them reminded me of who I'd been at 23, eager and confident and completely unaware of how much they didn't know. Others were more cautious, more thoughtful, already understanding that flying was as much about judgment as skill. I found myself telling them things I'd learned the hard way, hoping it would save them from having to learn the same way. "Your instruments don't care how you feel," I told a second lieutenant named Morrison after a particularly rough training flight. "When everything's going wrong and you're scared and your co-pilot's yelling and the alarms are screaming, your instruments are still telling you the truth. Trust them. Train yourself to listen even when your instincts are screaming something different." She nodded, making notes. 23 years old, fresh out of training, still had that shine of someone who thought she understood what service meant. She'd learn. They all did, eventually. The question was whether they'd learn before it cost them something permanent. I didn't talk about Reaper Outpost with them. It wasn't relevant to their training, and, honestly, I wasn't ready to field their questions. The general's interview had made it public knowledge, but public knowledge doesn't mean I wanted to discuss it over coffee in the ready room. Some things stayed private, even after declassification. 3 weeks after I'd said no to Lila's rent request, Mom called. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The tone she used when she was really asking something else. "Good. The work's different, but I like it." "That's good. Your father and I are proud of you." Pause. "Lila's been asking about you." There it was. "Has she?" "She wants to talk." She's struggling, Christina." With what the general said, with understanding what you've been through. She knows she was wrong. I looked out my office window at the flight line. AC-17 was taking off, engines roaring, powerful and precise. Did she say that? That she was wrong. Mom hesitated. Not in those exact words. But she's trying. Trying isn't the same as changing. I can't keep putting myself in situations where she hurts me and then expects me to fix it by explaining myself better. That's not how this works. I know. Mom's voice was soft. I'm not asking you to forgive her or come to dinner or anything like that. I just wanted you to know she's thinking about it. About what she said, what it meant, how she treated you. Okay, I said. Because what else was there to say? I couldn't control what Lila thought or felt. I could only control my own boundaries, my own choices, my own healing. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a while, watching aircraft come and go. The rhythm of it was soothing. Predictable. Controlled. Everything military aviation was supposed to be when it went according to plan. Dr. Rahman and I had our sessions over video now since I'd relocated. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. We'd been talking a lot about boundaries, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about what I owed to other people versus what I owed to myself. Your sister hurt you, Dr. Rahman said during one session. Repeatedly, deliberately. Even if she didn't fully understand the impact, the hurt is real. You don't owe her immediate forgiveness just because she's had a realization. I know, I said. But part of me feels guilty. Like I should be the bigger person. Take the high road, all those things people say when they want you to accept less than you deserve. Being the bigger person doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means choosing how you respond to it. She leaned forward slightly, her face serious on the screen. You've spent your career making hard decisions under pressure. Apply that same clear-eyed judgment to your personal life. What serves you? What helps you heal? What boundaries do you need? I thought about that for days afterward. What did I need? Not what my family expected, not what would make things easier for everyone else, but what I actually needed to move forward. Space. That was the first thing. Distance from the dynamics that had hurt me. Time to figure out who I was outside of being the responsible sister, the steady one, the person everyone leaned on. Respect. Not earned through dramatic revelations on television, but given as a baseline. My service, my experience, my struggles treated as real and valid without needing a 2-star general to verify them. And peace. The kind that comes from not constantly bracing for the next dismissive comment, the next joke at my expense, the next moment where I'd have to decide between defending myself and keeping the peace. For months into my rotation at Andrews, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Oh, 5 at 39, right on schedule for someone with my record. The promotion ceremony was small, just my squadron commander, a few colleagues, and my parents. I'd told Mom not to invite Lila. It wasn't about punishment or spite. It was about not having my moment overshadowed by the tension between us, by the unresolved hurt and resentment that would have filled the room. Dad shook my hand afterward, his grip firm and proud. Lieutenant Colonel, he said. That's a hell of an achievement, Christina. Thanks, Dad. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see him working up to something. Finally, I should have said something. That night at dinner, when Lila. I should have shut it down immediately. Yeah, I agreed. You should have. He nodded, accepting that. I was wrong. I was trying to keep the peace, but there are some things more important than peace. I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. Didn't fix the months of silence, of watching him avoid confrontation while Lila said things that cut me deeper than she knew. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A recognition that his choice had had consequences. I appreciate that, I said. Mom hugged me, tight and long, the way she had when I was young and something had hurt me. We're so proud of you, she whispered. Not just the rank. Everything. Who you are. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I looked at the new insignia. Silver oak leaf. One step closer to full colonel, to the level Dad had retired at. Part of me wondered if I'd make it that far. The promotion rates got tighter at each level, the competition fiercer. But another part of me, the part that had survived Reaper Outpost and every mission before and after it, knew I'd give it everything I had. Same as I always did. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't have saved, but I recognized the area code. Lila. Saw Mom's Facebook post about your promotion. Congratulations. You earned it. I stared at the message for a long time. Short, simple, no excuses or explanations. Was it enough? No. But it was different. Less defensive, less about her, more acknowledgement of me. I didn't respond that night. Let it sit. Let myself feel whatever I felt about it without the pressure to react immediately. That was growth too, Dr. Rahman had said. Not needing to respond to everything right away, taking time to understand my own feelings before engaging. 3 days later, I replied, "Thank you." Just that. No invitation to reconnect, no opening for a bigger conversation. An acknowledgement that I'd received her message, and that was all. If she wanted more, if she wanted to rebuild what she'd torn down, that would take time. Real time. Real change. Not just words sent in a text, because Mom probably told her she should reach out. The weeks that followed settled into a new normal. Training flights, debriefs, paperwork. Dinners with colleagues, professional relationships that didn't carry the weight of family history. Video sessions with Dr. Rahman where we talked less about the trauma itself and more about building a life that wasn't defined by it. I started sleeping better. Not perfectly, the nightmares still came, probably always would, but better. More nights where I slept through than not. And slowly, carefully, I started to understand something I'd been avoiding for years. I'd spent so much time trying to be the person everyone needed me to be, the steady sister, the reliable daughter, the decorated officer, that I'd lost track of who I actually was underneath all of it. The therapy, the distance from Lila, the new posting, all of it was giving me space to figure that out. I wasn't just my service record. Wasn't just my trauma. Wasn't just the sum of missions flown and lives saved and decisions made under fire. I was all of that, yes, but I was also a woman in her late 30s trying to build a life that felt like her own. Trying to figure out what peace looked like for someone who'd spent years in conflict zones. Trying to learn how to be gentle with herself in a world that had trained her to be hard. A week later, Lila texted again. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times, looking for subtext, for qualifications, for the kind of half apology that blames the hurt person for being hurt. But it was just those 6 words. Simple. Direct. I left it on read. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't know what to say. Sorry for what exactly? For the years of dismissive comments? For mocking my therapy? For that dinner where she declared PTSD wasn't real while I sat there trying not to break? An apology that vague could mean anything or nothing. And I wasn't ready to do the emotional labor of extracting specificity from her, of teaching her what she should be apologizing for. Months passed. I settled deeper into the training rotation, found a rhythm that worked. The nightmares came less frequently. I started going to the base gym, not just running, but actually working out, rebuilding strength I'd let atrophy. Small victories, but they accumulated into something bigger. Something that felt like reclaiming myself. Lila tried again. Small gestures this time instead of texts. A book arrived at my on-base address, one about military aviation history. No note, but the return address was hers. 2 weeks later, a text, saw this article about the Air Force's new training protocols. Made me think of you. With a link attached. I read the article. It was good, well-researched, actually relevant to what I was doing. Not the kind of thing someone sends as a performative gesture. The kind of thing someone sends because they're actually trying to understand your world. I didn't respond to that one either. But I didn't delete it. Dr. Rahman asked me about it in our next session. How does it feel, having her reach out? Uncomfortable, I admitted. Part of me wants to respond, rebuild things. The other part remembers exactly how much she hurt me and doesn't trust that she's actually changed. Both of those feelings can be true at the same time. I know. But what do I do with that? Whatever serves you best. You don't owe her a response just because she's making efforts. But you also don't have to keep the door locked if you think there's value in opening it, even a crack. 5 months after the general's interview, Mom called and asked if I'd come to dinner. Just her and Dad, she said. No Lila. No pressure. Just dinner like we used to have before everything got complicated. I went. It felt strange, walking into my childhood home without the tension of wondering what Lila would say, without bracing for impact. We ate pot roast and talked about normal things: Dad's woodworking projects, Mom's book club drama, my work training new pilots. Easy conversation. Comfortable. Halfway through dessert, Mom said, "Lila's been asking about you." I set down my fork. Has she? She's been different lately. Quieter. She's been reading about PTSD, about military service. She joined a volunteer group that works with veteran families. Mom looked at me carefully. I'm not asking you to forgive her or anything like that. I just thought you should know. Why are you telling me this? Because she's my daughter and I love her. And you're my daughter and I love you. And I hate that you're both hurting because of this. She reached across the table, put her hand over mine. But I also know she hurt you badly. I know sorry isn't enough. I just wanted you to know she's trying to be better. What you do with that information is up to you. I thought about that drive home. Lila, volunteering with veteran families. Reading about PTSD. Actually trying to understand the world she'd been so quick to dismiss. Was it genuine growth or performative guilt? And did it matter if the actions were the same either way? 2 weeks later, I texted her, "Coffee sometime?" She responded within minutes, "Yes." When? We met at a place halfway between her apartment and the base. Neutral territory. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen her look before. She'd always been the confident one, the one who walked into rooms like she owned them. But today she looked small. Uncertain. "Hi," she said as I sat down. "Hi." We ordered coffee. Made small talk about the weather, about traffic. Dancing around what needed to be said until finally she just said it. I was wrong. About everything. About what you do, what you've been through, what it means. She wasn't looking at me, was focused on her coffee cup like it held answers. I thought I understood service because Dad was Army. But I didn't understand anything. I just saw the uniform and the pride and the homecomings. I didn't see what it cost. I waited. Didn't make it easier for her. When the general talked about Reaper Outpost, about what you did, I realized I'd been treating your entire career like it was some administrative job. Like you pushed papers and flew empty planes from point A to point B. I didn't want to know it was more than that, because if it was more, then I'd been horrible to you for years. You were, I said quietly. She flinched, but nodded. I know. I've been volunteering with veteran families, hearing their stories, and every single one makes me think about how I treated you. How dismissive I was. How cruel. Why? I asked. Why were you like that? She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller. Because I was jealous. You were always the good one, the successful one. Dad was so proud of you. And when you came back from deployments different, struggling, I think part of me was relieved that you weren't perfect anymore. That you had problems too. She looked up at me then, eyes red. That's horrible. I know that's horrible. But it's true. I sat back, processing that. All this time, I'd thought she didn't understand. But it was worse than that. She'd understood enough to know I was hurting and had chosen to make it worse because of her own insecurities. I can't fix this in one conversation, she said. I know that. I don't know if I can fix it at all. But I want to try. Not because Mom's pushing me or because I feel guilty, but because you're my sister and I love you and I've been a terrible sister to you. I took a sip of my coffee. It was too hot, burned my tongue slightly, but the physical sensation was grounding. You hurt me, I said. Really deeply. For a long time. I know. And I'm not ready to just forgive that and move on. I know, she said again. But I'm here. That's something. She nodded, tears spilling over. That's more than I deserve. We sat there for another hour. Didn't solve anything, didn't magically repair years of damage. But we talked. Really talked, maybe for the first time since I'd joined ROTC. She asked questions about my work, careful questions, respecting when I said things were classified. I told her what I could, which wasn't much, but it was more than I'd shared before. When we left, she hugged me. Quick and awkward, but genuine. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Don't make me regret it, I replied. She smiled, sad but real. I'll try not to. Over the following months, we met a few more times. Short meetings, low stakes. Coffee mostly, occasionally lunch. She didn't joke about my service anymore. Didn't make comments about therapy or veterans or anything that might land wrong. And when she asked about my life, she actually listened to the answers. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness would take time, and I wasn't sure I'd ever fully get there. But it was something. A beginning. A recognition that people could change if they really wanted to, if they put in the work. Dr. Rahman was pleased with my progress. You set boundaries, she said. You protected yourself. And then, when you were ready and when she demonstrated real change, you opened the door slightly. That's healthy relationship management. It still feels fragile, I admit it. It is fragile. Rebuilding trust always is. But fragile doesn't mean worthless. It just means you have to be careful with it. Years later, as a lieutenant colonel with enough time and grade that full colonel was a realistic possibility, I was asked to speak at a military family summit. The topic was stigma and invisible wounds, and apparently my name had been suggested by someone who'd heard about my work training younger officers, about the way I talked openly with them about the realities of service. I almost said no. Public speaking wasn't my favorite thing, and talking about PTSD and trauma felt too personal for a conference stage. But the organizer was persistent, and eventually I agreed. If my story could help one family understand what their service member was going through, if it could prevent one person from going through what I'd gone through with Lila, it was worth the discomfort. Mom sat in the front row the day of the speech. And next to her, wearing a small PTSD awareness pin on her jacket, was Lila. I hadn't known she was coming. Hadn't invited her, actually. But Mom must have told her about it, and she'd chosen to come anyway. Chosen to sit there and listen while I talked about the hardest parts of my service, the struggles I'd had reintegrating, the stigma within families, and how damaging it could be. I didn't look at her during the speech. Couldn't. I focused on the back wall on my notes, on the other faces in the crowd who needed to hear this. But I knew she was there. Could feel her presence like a weight, not uncomfortable exactly, but significant. The hardest battles aren't always the ones in combat zones, I said near the end. Sometimes they're at kitchen tables, in family rooms, in conversations where the people who love you most can't or won't understand what you've been through. That isolation can be as damaging as the trauma itself. I paused, allowed myself to glance at the front row. Mom was crying quietly. Lila was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe. Regret. Understanding that came too late to prevent the damage, but early enough to start repair. But there's hope in growth, I continued. In people willing to listen, to learn, to admit when they've been wrong. In relationships that can survive honest conversations about hurt and healing. It's not easy. It's not quick. But it's possible. After the speech, people came up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask questions. I stood there for an hour, shaking hands, offering what support I could. When the crowd finally cleared, Lila was waiting off to the side. That was brave, she said. It was necessary. She nodded. I heard myself in parts of it. The things you described family members saying, the ways they dismiss or minimize. That was me. Yes, I said. It was. I'm glad I'm not that person anymore. I looked at her carefully. She'd changed in the years since that dinner. Softer somehow, less sharp edges. More willing to sit with discomfort instead of defending against it. You're not, I agreed. You've done the work. I'm still doing it, she corrected. Will be for a while, I think. We walked out together, Mom between us, linking her arms through ours like she used to when we were kids. Outside, the sun was bright and warm, and for the first time in years, being with my family didn't feel like walking through a minefield. That night, Lila posted something on social media. Not about me specifically, but about the summit, about what she'd learned, about the importance of supporting service members and veterans without qualification or conditions. It wasn't performative. It was honest, vulnerable even. And in the comments, when someone asked if she had personal experience with this, she wrote, "My sister is Air Force. I wasn't there for her the way I should have been. I'm trying to do better." I saw it because Mom sent me a screenshot, not because I was monitoring Lila's social media. I read it twice, let it settle. It wasn't an apology exactly. We'd had those already, multiple times. It was something else. Public accountability. An acknowledgement that she'd been wrong and was working to be better. That's when I learned something I hadn't expected. Respect isn't given when you demand it. It's earned when the truth finally stands on its own. The general's interview had given me external validation I hadn't been seeking. But this, Lila's slow and difficult growth, her willingness to sit in discomfort and change, this was different. This was internal validation. Proof that some relationships could survive honesty, could be rebuilt on stronger foundations. Some wounds never fully heal. The nightmares still came sometimes, though less frequently now. Certain sounds still made me flinch. There were stories I'd never be able to tell, missions that would stay classified long after I retired. The weight of Reaper Outpost and every other operation didn't disappear just because people finally understood it was real. But acknowledgement, that's where peace starts. Not in dramatic revelations or forced apologies, but in the slow accumulation of small moments where people choose understanding over assumptions, where they do the work to bridge gaps instead of insisting the gaps don't exist. Lila and I would never have what we'd had before. That sister relationship, built on childhood closeness and shared history, was gone. But we were building something new. Something more honest, more resilient. Built on mutual respect and recognition of each other's full humanity, not just the convenient parts. That was enough. Not perfect, but enough. I made Lieutenant Colonel at 39. If things continued on track, I might make full colonel by my mid-40s, match Dad's rank before he retired. But more than that, I'd built a life that felt like mine. A career that mattered. Relationships that were genuine. And a hard-won understanding that my worth wasn't determined by whether other people could comprehend my experiences. The truth had always been there. In the cockpit of every aircraft I'd flown, in every mission I'd completed, in every person I'd brought home safely. It didn't need a general's validation to exist. It didn't need my sister's approval to matter. But it was nice, finally, that the people closest to me could see it too. That's the lesson I tried to pass on to the younger officers I trained. Your service is real regardless of who acknowledges it. Your struggles are valid whether anyone understands them or not. You don't owe anyone explanations that diminish your experience. But if people are willing to learn, willing to grow, willing to sit with discomfort and choose understanding, that's worth nurturing. That's how we build communities that support each other instead of tearing each other down. Years from now, when I eventually retire, I'll look back on my career and see the missions, the promotions, the aircraft I flew, and the people I trained. But I'll also see this: the moment I learned that standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept less than I deserved wasn't selfish or harsh. It was necessary. It was survival. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it's the beginning of something better than what was broken. Thanks for watching. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that invisible wounds are real. I post more true stories about boundaries, service, and respect. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had your pain dismissed by family? What did you do next? Where did you draw the first boundary, and how did people react? If you've apologized for minimizing someone else's struggle, what changed your mind? What would you say to a loved one who calls PTSD attention-seeking? For those in uniform or supporting someone who is what actually helps after a hard tour. Do you believe forgiveness requires reconciliation, or can they be separate? Drop your thoughts below and tell me where you're tuning in from. Your story might help someone tonight.